Hi, I'm Kay Lemon, Executive Director at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, nonprofit MSI serves as the bridge between marketing theory and business practice. Our goal is to move the needle on significant marketing problems. We do this by funding research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted on by our 70-plus corporate sponsors and disseminating that research through members-only events and a variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Elie during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following his presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Elie Ofek is the T.J. Dermot Dunphy Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. His research explores links between new product development and marketing decisions and examines how companies integrate marketing input when formulating innovation strategies and performing commercial forecasts. His research also focuses on implications of digital technologies on firms' marketing mix decisions. His work has appeared in all the top management and marketing journals, as well as the Harvard Business Review. He's an MSI Young Scholar, and he's one of the authors of the recent book, Innovation Equity, which we'll be talking to us about today. Welcome, Elie.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kay, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and be talking about the recent book. And as you can see from the title, what we're going to try to do is combine a few elements here in order to sort of get at something that we're calling innovation equity, which is basically what an innovation is really worth. And so with that, since innovation is so prevalent here in this title, why don't we talk about some innovations? I'm sure many of you will recognize the innovations on this slide. And the interesting thing about these innovations is that they are in various phases of sort of their evolution. Some had been launched a few years ago and now are on a start and stop type situation. Some have not yet been launched commercially, and some have, and they are still diffusing in the population. So what can we say about these innovations to set the stage for what it is that we're trying to do with sort of our research and what it is that we're trying to sort of convey in this presentation today? So when you think about the first one, I'm sure many of you screamed Google Glass. The interesting thing is that when it was launched, or even right before it was launched, there were a lot of opinions saying, this is going to revolutionize computing. And the first version that was launched, which was an Explorer version, or at least the people that were adopting them were called Explorers, was adopted basically immediately. Everybody in that group that was identified as an Explorer got their hands on it and adopted it. But as we all know, a couple of years after that, Google put the halt on it, and maybe that's not surprising because there were a lot of reactions which were of the nature of, this is an amazing technology, but I just can't imagine my mom wearing them, and this was by Twitter's co-founder. Let's move on to another innovation I'm sure many of you here might recognize, maybe not from the picture on the left, but certainly from the picture on the right where you see somebody in a car and he's reading a newspaper. So assuming that the car is moving, this is the driverless car. And of course reactions are mixed. Some love it, think it's going to be very useful. However, some fear it and think it won't be useful at all. It's useless. Okay? Take another innovation. Well, here we go, Dropbox. Cloud storage service. This is, of course, an innovation that was launched several years ago, and it's still with us. It's still diffusing. The thing there is, well, how do you sort of spur more adoption of this? Do you use Google search ads, or do you offer more referral incentives? But on the same token, while the number of users has been going up, they're still losing money. And so the question is, do they have the right business model? And so when you think about innovations in these various phases and with these various issues surrounding them, what is the sort of problem or problems that you might want to tackle when you think about it? So it's all about the expected commercial performance of the innovation, but that's going to depend on primarily two things. First, do people really want it? And if so, how many and when will they want it? Secondly, even if sort of they kind of want it and they see the usefulness of it, can you really make money off of it? And if so, how much money can you make? And when, if at all, are you going to break even on any investment that you might have made on that innovation? But it doesn't stop there, because as the Dropbox example shows us, you might want to affect things, both in terms of adoption and profitability, through marketing efforts, through tackling different segments, and addressing competitive issues. And so the question is, how can you do that? And so in terms of innovations that we've seen, and any innovation that you can think of, this question of what is the expected commercial performance before the innovation is sort of diffused completely in the population and we know exactly what's going to happen, that's kind of a central issue that companies face when they want to launch new products, new services, or when they have just recently been launched and they're thinking about what to do next. And so in order to sort of think about these problems, let's try to get some answers and not leave them completely open. And that's going to be basically the sort of flow of the presentation today, is basically how do we think about the adoption, how do we think about the profitability, how do we think about factors that can affect that, and in all cases ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to put a dollar value on some of these questions when we look for the answers. So on the front of will they adopt, when will they adopt, and so on, what comes to mind with innovation, of course, is that the challenge of forecasting the demand is the uncertainty, is that a lot of innovations come with these what we call adoption barriers. Are the benefits worth the price? Will it work at all? What are the costs to install? I mean, do I have to spend a lot of time learning about it? Is it worth it? So really it boils down to thinking about facing this uncertainty. What is it that spurs someone to decide to adopt despite those uncertainties? And it's that point where you think about the forces that might help or cause that to happen, or otherwise, what routes might somebody take to adoption? And so the idea here is that while you can think about adoption in many ways, to simplify things from the standpoint of somebody looking to sort of really get at the heart of adoption, you can think of it as following one of two routes. Either somebody sort of learns about that innovation, maybe trials it and demos it, maybe sees some ads for it, basically on their own recognizing why it might be worth it for them, why it might be beneficial. So that's one route one could take to adoption, is that individual force pushing them, or pulling them, if you like, towards that innovation. However, you might think that there's another route to adoption, and particularly today with all the digital and social media that we have around us, which is a social force, which is you hear from others, you see others benefiting, and that pulls you, draws you into the innovation, helps you overcome those barriers. And those social forces could be in the form of the word of mouth that we think about, where people just tell you, or you listen, or you get an email, and so on. It could be a social force because the more people that have adopted, the more the innovation itself is worth it for you. So if you think about Dropbox, the more friends and family and coworkers you have on Dropbox, the more it's worth your while to get on it because you can collaborate and share files. And there could be also a social compatibility issue here, which is you don't want to necessarily be the only one with the innovation, so the more and more people are already with it, the more it becomes acceptable to have it as well. So the idea here is basically you can either have a force that's independent of everybody else and you on your own decide to adopt, or it's a function of how many other people have already adopted. To get a little bit of more sort of visualization, getting a little bit more clarity on that, I've put together here a little schematic, graphic, visual, whatever you want to call it, to think about it and move us from that description of forces towards a simple conceptualization of a model that can help us think about the diffusion. So what you see here is on the very right-hand side, you got that innovation, that light bulb in the blue background, which seems sort of very tempting and appealing. But you got your pool of people that have not yet adopted. It's basically your population that you think it's relevant for them. And they're asking themselves, gosh, should I adopt this innovation? And so one thing that could get them to adopt is that individual force. They learn about the innovation. They hear from the company potentially. They do whatever research they need. They demo it and so on, and they decide to adopt. But once a few of these people have adopted because of that individual force, then what you have is suddenly that pool of adopters starts filling up, right? They move from that top box to that lower ellipse. And what they can do then is affect other people to adopt as well through the social force. And so what you get is this movement of people from non-adopters to adopters due to either one of these two forces. And basically then you can just simply put together a simple model that says that the new adopters today, well, they're going to be comprised of people that are being influenced by that individual force, plus the people that are being influenced by the social force, times how many people have already adopted, right? Because the social force is dependent on how many people have already adopted. And that then multiplies how many people are still left in that top box. And that's basically a formulation of a diffusion model that shows you that it changes over time, because the more people adopt, the more people you have in the past adoption. And so that social effect, which is the force times how many people have already adopted, gets stronger and stronger. And then when you plot it out, if you take those three key elements that you need, that what is the sort of overall population that the innovation could be relevant for, what kind of an individual force do you have, which is basically the likelihood that people will get it on their own and adopt it, and then what is that force that is a function of the number of people that have already adopted. If you plot that out, and what I have here is a plot that shows you for a total market potential of about 50 million people, that would be what, roughly about a little less than a sixth of the U.S. population. What you get is a pattern of adoption that shows you that adoption is going to start relatively low level. Then when it reaches roughly year 13 or 14 in this plot, it reaches a relatively high level where about 3.5 million people are adopting per year, and then it drops off again as basically the entire population has already adopted. And what you could do also is plot the total number of adopters up until a point. So the plot that we see now is how many people are adopting in each period. But if you plot the cumulative number of adopters, then what you'll see is the pattern of penetration. And you can see that what this diffusion model allows you to do, depending on the levels of those parameters, is depict different patterns of innovation diffusion. So for example, the pattern on the very left is a very steep one. The individual force is very high. This is like an innovation that everybody already gets it right away why they need it. And so they don't need to even wait to hear from others. They don't need to wait for a critical mass of adopters to influence them. On the flip side, the very right-hand side diffusion, cumulative diffusion, is one where it starts extremely slow because nobody's willing to adopt unless they see other people using it or wanting it. But once that happens, it's very steep and it takes off. So that's kind of what this model allows you to do depending on the levels of these forces and your total potential market. So let's take an example. Satellite radio, which I'm sure many people are familiar because anytime you want to get a new car, you'll basically have that as an option in there. But the interesting thing about this innovation is when it was launched a little over a decade ago, the companies involved had to provide a forecast or had to think about how many people will adopt satellite radio. And it wasn't trivial because they were going to charge a monthly fee, something that had never been done for radio. And the question was, how many people will want it, and also at what pace will they want it, right? Because the pace matters here. And so what they did is a simple market research where they tried to get adoption intent from people at various price levels and price points. They also had secondary data on car radio listenership, and they knew the adoption, how many cars are out there and how much people listen. And from that, they could kind of create at least a sense of what that long-run market potential is for an innovation like this. And in that visual that we had, that was that top box with all those people in it. Then they had to get a sense of the forces, the individual and social. So what they did is they said, well, look, we know how CD players have diffused. We know how automobile radios, the regular ones, have diffused. And we know cellular phones. We know their forces. So we think that satellite radio is going to be somewhat similar to that. So you can take that as a first cut. You can obviously complement that with some market research to sort of fine-tune those estimates, but at least it starts giving you a ballpark of how is something like satellite radio going to diffuse over time. And this is kind of a plot of the cumulative adoption of satellite radio as a category based on those parameters that we saw before. So roughly a total market potential of about 28 to 30 million, and forces according to what we had on the previous slide. And what you can see is this is what they would expect pre-launch for an innovation like satellite radio. And we'll talk later about how close it came to the actual, but this is something that can already get you into the ballpark. And you can ask yourself, what's the significance of the fact that for the most part, and this is corroborated by actual data from many innovations, that it has that S-shape, that cumulative adoption has that S-shape? Well, the significance is that if instead of taking into account how innovations typically diffuse through those routes of individual and social force, you just have a linear rule for how your innovation is going to diffuse in a population, what you can immediately see is that you're going to be over-forecasting early and under-forecasting late. And of course this has many implications. So for example, if you were an analyst and you had predicted about 6-7 million cumulative adoptions by year 3, right? And in reality it's only about 3 million, then you might look at the data and say, oh my God, things are not going well. We predicted 6 million, it's only about 3 million. Freak out, do things that you wouldn't plan to do. So by properly taking into account the fact that it does have that S-shape, and I'll just elaborate for a moment again why it has that S-shape, but by taking that into account, you're more likely to get close to the actual diffusion. And the S-shape happens, again, if there is a social force and a small individual force, then what will happen is people will be waiting first for that critical mass of adoption before they adopt, and that gives it that kind of shallow start. And then of course the shallow ending is because at some point you've exhausted the pool of potential adopters, and adoption pace starts slowing down. And so that's for the diffusion part. Remember, we said that there's a couple of problems here with expected commercial performance of innovations, right, from those motivating examples. So the first part was, well, how do we figure out how people want the innovation? How do we figure out when they'll adopt and so on? So that's taken care of by that diffusion model, which by the way is also called a Bass model because early versions of it were from a scholar called Frank M. Bass. But the second part of this, the profitability part of this, really only just gets started when somebody adopts, because once acquired, the firm really has to manage these adopters not as adopters anymore, but as customers. And it's at that point when you transition from thinking about somebody as just an adopter, a potential adopter, somebody I just got to get on board, to a customer, then it starts triggering those thoughts of relationships. And how do you think about a relationship with a customer over time? And so that is something that we also have dealt a lot with in marketing, in this sort of customer relationship management aspect of it. And we kind of know that, well, if you want to figure out how much a customer is worth to you in the long run, you got to understand what kind of revenues they're giving to you versus the cost you have to serve them. That's your profit margin on the customer. But there's also the other problem, which is, gosh, you want to hang on to those customers because if they leave, that's it. There's no more profit margin. So there's a retention rate story here, which is how long can you keep them on board. And if you just take a look at some examples here for credit cards, satellite radio, and telecommunications, so the top left here gives you what the retention rate is for each period. So you can see, for example, that T-Mobile has about 72-73% retention rate. What that means is that with 72% or 0.72 probability, somebody's going to stay with you the next period, but with 27% probability, they're going to leave. And this graph simply shows you that if you have a cohort of people that join in year one, and you just track that cohort because each period there's a probability they're going to leave you, then at some point, by year 20, you barely have anybody left from that cohort. Now, of course, what you're hoping to happen is that you acquire new customers to compensate you for those lost customers. But as a rule, we know from marketing, sort of customer relationship management in marketing, that there is this issue of a retention rate that you have to keep tabs on. Now, if a customer does stay with you, though, and has not yet left you, then you can't really take that customer's revenue nominally. If you're looking at it from today's point of view, you have to discount that. So we kind of know in marketing that we like to look at customers as a relationship over time. We like to look at them as a financial asset. We like to look at the revenue stream from them. But if they do stay with you and don't leave, then you better discount those profits. And that leads to sort of this notion of a customer lifetime value, where what you're doing really is you're summing that customer's profit margin times the probability that they'll stay, and you're discounting the fact that the revenue comes at different periods, and that's how you're getting the sort of customer lifetime value, by summing over each period the profit margin times the probability that they're going to stay with you, divided by that discount factor. And so then you can also account for any expenses you've put to acquire those customers in the first place, and you get that your customer lifetime value has those 4 ingredients of your profit margin, your retention rate, your discount factor, and any acquisition costs that you want to take away from that. And that gives you sort of the value of that customer to you as a firm over time. And here's an example. We talked about Dropbox. So let's say you get somebody to convert to a premium customer, right? That's their business model. You sign up for free, you get some space for your files, but then in order to make any money off of you, they hope you become a premium customer. So what you could do is you could say, look, what does it mean to be a premium customer? I make about $110 a year, because it's about $10 a month. Some people get a discount, so roughly $110 a year, less the cost to serve them, which is the server space they have to allocate to you and any other marketing they do along the way. So that's about $85 of profit margin from you a year. They know their retention rate is roughly 82.5%, meaning that's the probability you'll stay a customer year after year. And then there's a discount factor. And so what you could do is you could say, well, based on these figures, I know each customer I convert to premium, the lifetime value of that customer to me is about $340. And what you could do is you can compare that to the cost of acquiring and then converting somebody to be premium to see if it's worth your while to do whatever you're doing as a marketer. Now, what happens when you take that customer relationship management, which allows you to think about customers as financial assets, and you marry that, you let that meet your innovation diffusion model? Well, interesting things happen. First, you got to be aware that you can't just take the customer lifetime value numbers and just multiply them by the long-run market potential and say, that's what the innovation is worth, because I know how many people will ultimately adopt. I think I know what each one is worth to me as a lifetime value, and let me multiply those numbers. Why does that not work? Because not all that long-run potential joins at the same time. They join at different times, because that's what the diffusion model tells me, right? So you can look at the diffusion model again, and you can see that those little triangles tell you how many people are expected to adopt at any given year. And you can see that it takes time for this long-run potential to happen. And because time is money, then while you can calculate a lifetime value of each one of the people that adopt on this curve, you have to then discount that entire lifetime value to bring it back to the current period, because that's when you're doing your assessment. And so the idea here is that if you think about that diffusion curve and you layer on top of it the lifetime value of those people when they join, then from the vantage point of today, t equals 0, so to speak, what you have is those little dots on the curve, they represent how many new adopters are coming in each period. And then those lines represent the lifetime value of those customers. And then as you can see, as time progresses, that lifetime value is worth less and less because it's coming much later. And that starts giving you a sense of, you really want to get those customers in early, assuming you can make some money off of them, because they're worth more when you get them early rather than late. But the idea is here that the diffusion model gives you an ability to understand when people are joining, and the lifetime value model gives you an idea of how much they're worth once they join. And when you bring that all together and properly discount everything, that's when you can get that financial aspect of the innovation's equity. And that's kind of what we have here. Combining those two models, you get the present value of the innovation, i.e. innovation equity. So just to recap on what we've done so far, so the road to innovation equity, 5 easy steps. The first 4. Get the number of new adopters in each period from the diffusion curve that you've built. Then get a sense of the customer lifetime value when a customer is acquired. Multiply the number of new adopters by their CLV. So for each period you'll have how many people have adopted times what you expect their customer lifetime value to be. But then discount every time depending on when they joined in order to bring it to the present value. And then step number 5, when you sum all the periods, voila, drum roll, you get innovation equity. And so that's kind of in a nutshell the idea behind innovation equity. It's to take an innovation, break it down to the factors that affect adoption so that you can get a sense of when people adopt and how robustly they adopt. Other part of it is taking all the machinery and everything we know from customer relationship management to understand how adopters are worth once they join, and then bring it all together in order to look at it from any point in time and say, okay, looking forward, what is the equity of that innovation today? But what else can you do with this? So the other thing you can do, once you can sort of have a sort of monetary sense of the innovation's worth going forward, you can then say, well, I can look at marketing actions, look at how they affect innovation equity, and then see whether or not it makes sense to undertake that effort. So example, let's say you're a home video console maker and you want to institute a price cut on your console. Or let's say that you're some hardware company, even satellite radio on the radios themselves, and you want to offer a subsidy on the radio. Or maybe you're Dropbox, the cloud file storage service, and you're thinking about increasing the referral incentive that you offer for people such that when they refer, they get even more space. Is it worth it? And so basically the idea here is that, yeah, you launch the innovation, that's kind of at the left-hand side, and then you get these adopters to be customers, and you develop them and you try to retain them, and that allows you to calculate innovation equity. But then you can look at marketing actions either to affect more acquisition, either to affect more money that you can make from customers, that's the customer development, or to affect retention, and then calculate the change in innovation equity to understand the implications of your marketing action. So for example, let's say you're the console maker. You want to have a price cut. What's that going to do? Well, let's say that because it's cheaper, more people are going to consider buying it. So you can say that the price cut, I should sort of do some market research to see sensitivity, and that would increase the total market potential. But it could also get people that are already considering, so they thought of buying this in the first place, but they were waiting for the price to come down, and once you do it, it'll speed up their adoption. That's going to increase their individual force. But what's the trade-off? So while your diffusion is going to get quicker and more robust, you're going to make less money on each person that adopts because they pay less for the console. And so the customer lifetime value will go down. Let's say that you are the cloud file storage and you want to give more referral incentive. So how do you think about that? Well, you might get people to be more aggressive in recommending the service because they want to get more space. So that's going to increase the social force, right? Because they're going to offer it to more and more of their friends. And you can get more people to be invited in the first place. So it's going to be an increase in the total market potential. What's the trade-off? The more space you offer to people for free just to refer, the lifetime value is going to go down because less people are going to be premium. And so what you could do is you could use innovation equity to calculate the difference between before and after and understand the implications of what you're going to be doing for sort of the profitability, relevance, or when will you expect a return on that change. And the interesting thing also is that we look at an arrow that says, well, once you get acquired, the firm wants to develop you, so the arrow goes from acquisition to development. But in all reality, a lot of marketing actions have that backflow arrow, which is changes that I make to the customer development, meaning it's less probable that I'll get somebody to upgrade, but at the same time, I'm going to acquire more people, has that backflow arrow. And so all these implications are possible to couch within this framework that we're talking about. And by thinking about, on the one hand, adoptions and when they're going to happen, diffusion model, and at the same time, customer lifetime value. What else can you think about? All right, let's talk about the retention part of this. What happens when you lose a customer? So on the one hand, it has an implication for the CRM part of things because you're no longer earning money from that customer, so no more CLV from them. That's the direct loss of no more revenues or profits from that customer. But there's an indirect loss, which is one less customer is one less person that exerts a social force. And so that's going to affect diffusion, and you better take that into account. So it's not just that you lose some money directly on those people that no longer are utilizing the service. It's also that they're probably no longer sort of promoting it. And that's why it becomes really interesting to look at innovation equity here, the sort of calculations that I've been talking about and the framework I've been talking about, because what you could do, the direct loss is obvious once you know the customer lifetime value, but the indirect loss is interesting because you need to take into account the implications on diffusion and customer lifetime value. So you can see that the total loss is actually much higher than just the direct loss when you take the other into account. And obviously the reason it's decreasing is because the farther out into the future you lose that customer, the less material it becomes. So if you lose that customer very early, you're going to lose a lot of social impact. If you lose them pretty late, that's okay. So that's kind of what that's capturing here. And again, to show you that this framework allows you to think about not just those forward-going arrows from development to retention, but also the retention piece has a lot of implications for the earlier stages. Okay, moving along to other issues that can be relevant to think about in the context of innovation. You look at this diffusion picture and you say, wait a minute, that doesn't look like the diffusion pictures you've shown me before. What's this awkward sort of two-humped pattern here? And indeed, what's wrong in quotation marks is that it's not the traditional bell shape. It looks more like a saddle. And it turns out that some innovations, about 30 or 40% of innovations, actually exhibit this pattern. And what does this pattern mean? It means that the innovation starts diffusing, seems like it's doing well, reaches a peak in terms of number of sales or adoptions in a period, and then it takes a dip before it then climbs back up and takes another peak. And that dip or trough in the saddle can last for several years, and it can be about 20% drop from the first peak, sort of on average. And the question is, why does it happen? Why do some innovations like color TVs, PCs, VCRs, EVs, why did their diffusion pattern exhibit this kind of a picture? Well, the reason is that what if instead of just one type of customer, there's more like segments out there, and these segments are very different. And what if we tried to build a diffusion model for each one of these segments? And so what you see here is I've kind of unpacked that total diffusion curve that we saw at the beginning by two separate diffusion curves, one for a segment that we're calling here innovation forwards, and one for a segment here that we're calling the moderates. And what you see is that the forwards are very quick to adopt. You might think of them as the early adopters. They have a very high individual force, and they're not that big in size, whereas the second segment is more like mainstream types, and their forces are different. That's why you need to separate them out to get to this picture. They have a low individual force. They don't really think they need it early on, or it's not worth their time, money, and so on. And they mainly listen to themselves. They want to see other mainstreamers. And so that's why you can get a situation where the innovation forwards, their adoption curve peaks and goes down, and we're still waiting for those innovation moderates to sort of take off on their adoption, and that's why you might get a pattern like that. And of course, their lifetime value parameters could differ as well, and therefore you really need to calculate a different innovation equity for each of them in order to really understand how the commercial performance of that innovation is going to look like. And there could be other things going on when you have multiple segments. So you could have actually a positive interaction between early adopters and later adopters. If that's the case, you're going to get a very fast adoption with a single peak. But you could have a situation that's even more extreme than the first picture we saw, which is that the moderates have absolutely no individual force. They don't really understand at all why they need the innovation, and they're not affected at all by the sort of early adopters' innovation forwards. And that you can get what's called, what you might have heard of, as a chasm. So the interesting thing about this whole framework is that it can also capture phenomena that have been seen out there with innovation, like chasm. And you might think that the Google Glass is currently in its chasm. So early adopters, the explorers, they latched onto it, but the mainstream really didn't get it, and no other mainstreams sort of made them feel like they need it. And so it's kind of now stuck in the chasm, waiting for Google or some other player to come up with smart eyewear that'll take it out of that chasm. All right. Another thing that we kind of promised in that early roadmap slide of the problems that you might want to solve with innovation has to do with competition. So once you start thinking about the fact that typically innovation captures a new category or a new type of technology, but there are multiple players that offer it. So the first thing that comes to mind is that when this thing is going to get launched, you might get people switching from one sort of player to another, one brand to another, just like a Galaxy user could decide for their next version to get an iPhone. But when you have competition, you might also get another thing going on, which is people that have adopted one brand cause people that have not yet adopted even, so it's not switching, they haven't yet adopted, cause them to get into the category but choose a rival's product. And that's this phenomena where you might have sort of know the metaphor, which is a rising tide can lift all boats. So you could argue that, for example, the iPhone created so much buzz, it created a big tide. So of course iPhone benefited from its own tide by getting a lot of people to join iPhone, but the entire smartphone category might benefit as well. And so what you have here is a situation where in order to tackle competition, you need to a little bit expand your point of view. You need to say, look, here's this available market potential here on the left. And here are these two firms that come out with an innovation, and they both want to get some of that available market potential. So each one of them is going to have the individual force and social force that's relevant to get people to adopt their innovation. However, they have to take into account that people can be switching from one of the brands to another, and they have to take into account that some of their adopters might actually get some new people to adopt the rival as well. And I know this is going to look even more complicated, but you also have to take into account that because there's uncertainty around innovation, a lot of times some people adopt, and after they adopt, the uncertainty resolves and says, I don't need this, or I'm not willing to pay for it. Or they just no longer have the money to use it, or certain things change in their lives and they no longer need that innovation, and so you get disadoption. So the reality is when we've studied many innovations, you see that there are a few things going on, and you don't want to confuse each one of these demand elements when you come up with an estimate. But the interesting thing here is, remember, this is all about combining two models. This is about thinking about innovation diffusion and lifetime value. And so what you need to be careful here is that when you calculate your customer lifetime value, you better take into account that the attrition that you face, the customers that you lose, they could be going to two places. They could be churning to your rival, and they can be deciding to get out of the category. But that has to equal the retention rate, or has to be related to the retention rate that you're using in your lifetime value model. Remember, we talked about the fact that only with some probability do people stay. And so you can build a model like that, or at least take into account some of these factors in order to extend the model, if you like, to take into account competitive forces. And so as I promised, let me get back to this XM example to see how that forecast sort of panned out in practice. But in order to do that, let's first ask ourselves what happened a few years after the launch. Well, the innovation as a category was still diffusing. There were about 4.4 million adopters, which was just about 15% of the total expected market potential. And at the time, XM had about 3 times the number of adopters as Sirius did. Both were using the same business model, so it was very competitive at about $13 a month. Both promised no advertising on music channels, and it started to become an arms race because of competition to secure talent and exclusive content. And basically what happened is, they were trying to get the same stars. And so that's when Sirius landed Howard Stern in 2006 and offered him $100 million a year, stock incentives, if the number of subscribers he could bring would exceed the initial forecast. And this is interesting because it brings us back to this idea of it's like a marketing action. You could think of it as improving the product or creating a big communication buzz because he was out talking about his move to satellite radio. And indeed, acquisition costs started going down for Sirius while they stayed high for XM that had to battle the fact that it didn't have Howard Stern. And so you might ask, who's going to win? Who's going to lose? Is everybody going to lose? And so on. Or is everybody going to win? So first, if you look at the graph in terms of cumulative adoption, so what you see here is that the forecasted model are the sort of diamond shapes, and actual radio diffusion are the triangles. And you can see that pretty much it's a very close or tight fit up until the Stern deal was kind of announced, and then he joined actually in 2006. It was announced in late 2004. And so the forecast, based on data that was only available prior to the launch, it did pretty well to forecast 3-4 years out. And what you also can see, though, because the actual jumps up farther ahead after 2005, once things started going into motion, and certainly from 2006, is that there was a Howard Stern effect. It really bumped up category diffusion. And you could, of course, at that point, recalculate your model, taking into account there's going to be a bigger individual force, a bigger social force, and even a bigger market potential, given that Howard Stern is now on satellite radio. And if you look at the actual way it broke down by company, the interesting thing that you see is that not only Sirius benefited from this move, meaning if you compare the actual subscribers to their forecasts, and you look at those last 2 columns of actual minus forecast for each company, both of them got more than they expected post Howard Stern. And that sort of shows you that this idea of a rising tide lifts all ships certainly happened here. Stern was able to collect his stock bonuses because he exceeded the targets. But the nice thing is, when you calculate the innovation equity change of Stern's coming on board versus the payouts that you paid to him, you can see that if they had examined this in 2004, right before they signed him, and said, is it worth it? Is it worth paying him $100 million and all the stock options? Then basically you would get, it's almost a wash. It is more profitable than not, but the idea was also that it allowed Sirius to close the subscriber gap, because as you remember at the time, XM was 3 times, in 2004 the numbers were even worse. I'm showing you here 2005. By 2008 though, Sirius was able to close that gap. So what happened? For XM, obviously marketing costs started going up. The deals to get other artists got more expensive, and that's when they decided to merge. And that's why today the whole entity is called Sirius XM, as a way for them to sort of allow themselves to combine forces and not have to face that steep competition, but just enjoy the sort of added effect that they got from getting Stern. So to summarize what we've covered today, I think the idea has been this. In academia, we have a lot of knowledge on innovation diffusion. We've studied a lot of innovations. We got something to say. At the same time, we know a lot about customer management, and this is true both in academia and from things we learned from practice. And can you combine those two, what you know on innovation, diffusion, and adoption, and what you know on customer management, to do something, create some vehicle that will allow you to get a sense, to assess and manage the expected dollar value of innovations? Answer, yes, innovation equity is our answer. And the relevance, beyond just calculating ROI on development effort, beyond just calculating the worth, implications for marketing actions, how to think about multiple segments, and allowing for competitive forces are all within this scope. A few other things that you can think about that I haven't covered today: what happens when successive generations come out, CDs to MP3 players to whatever music you want to think about today. You can think about global issues, because then you can start having cross-country effects in terms of diffusion, and there could be effects on the lifetime value as well. So all of these are in the realm of scope of what you might want to do or might want to think about when you combine innovation diffusion with customer management in one sort of framework. And as Kay was sort of kind enough to say, all of this is related to the book that we have, which is called Innovation Equity: Assessing and Managing the Monetary Value of New Products and Services, that was just launched late last year. And my two co-authors on that, Eitan Mueller at NYU and Barak Libai at IDC Herzliya. So with that, Kay, I think I kind of have covered all that I was hoping to, and happy to take any questions if there are.
Elie, that was great. As you know, I focused a lot of my work on the customer management side, and it was really exciting to see how you can combine the diffusion of innovation side with the customer management side. And we have a couple questions, so let me get right to them. So one of them says, this is cool, I like what you're talking about. It occurs to me that with most innovations, the early bird producer has a corner on the market and usually charges a premium. Later, there are knockoffs that lead to more competition and lower margins. So would the CLV for early adopters, particularly when you have this successive entrance, be even more than you've suggested in what you've talked about today?
That's a great question, and two parts to it. So yes, absolutely. So if you think about, let's say, two types of segments in the population, where the early adopters are the ones that are willing to pay more and they'll stay with the innovation despite knockoffs, then they will have separate elements of their CLV. Now, you could say that you do anticipate at some point knockoffs coming in, and you will have to reduce your price, and sometimes, unfortunately, even your good customers that are willing to pay more, you'll have to offer them that price. So you might take that into account in advance, or refine your model, redo it once those knockoffs come in. So definitely have in your mind that you will have customers early that you will be charging a lot. Their CLV might change a little bit, but you might need to get customers later on that you attract with sort of steep acquisition cost incentives in order to attract them from the knockoffs. And so you will have to do that. The other part of this is there could be an effect that we are seeing, that sometimes when copycats come in, it actually does your brand a little bit. It can help your brand in the sense that there's more talk about it. Some people that would never have bought or paid full price will buy the knockoff, but they will start generating social media and all other kinds of buzz that then affects people that are still willing to pay or are willing to sort of come on and want the legit version, and you benefit from that cross effect. So those are two parts to the answer, but it is something that I think you need to take into account if you anticipate, based on experience from similar innovations, that at some point knockoffs are going to come in, so you need to think about your customer lifetime value parameters accordingly.
That's great. So we had a question particularly focused on CPG, or consumer packaged goods. So thinking about how do you bring marketing spend into the product forecast? So you talked about kind of a marketing action that might happen after the customer's acquired, but how do you then, when you're thinking about that initial forecast for the diffusion model, how do you bring variance in marketing spend into the product forecast?
Fabulous. I think that's a great question. So that individual force that's going to get people to adopt is obviously going to also be a matter of how aggressively and effectively is the firm going to market the product. And so what you could think about is 2 or 3 different types of, let's say, marketing outlays that you're going to accompany the launch with, and maybe even persist with subsequent to the first few months or years after the launch. And basically what you're going to have to take into account is the more aggressive your marketing is going to be, the higher that individual force is going to be. All else equal. and assuming you can do it effectively. So that's the way to do it. So if you're not going to do any marketing whatsoever, the chances are that it's going to take a long time for people to find out about you and on their own realize that they should adopt this. Or if your distribution network is going to be very limited, they're going to have very limited access to actually demo or try the product. So the way to do that is to either incorporate that directly into your individual force or to have a multiplier on that individual force for the amount of time that you're going to do that marketing effort. And if you suddenly decide to take it out, then in your spreadsheet, when you go period by period, you'd need to reduce that multiplier on your individual force, because typically that's what happens. I will say, though, that today we're learning and today we're seeing that sometimes marketing actions have an effect on the social force. Why? Because a lot of times a clever, good marketing campaign will go viral. And then what will happen is people will start spreading that ad, and then there's a little bit of a social component to the effect. So depending on the type of campaign, you might need it to affect either of those forces.
That's very cool. I love this notion of kind of the multiplier on the individual force or the social force, and you can do a sensitivity analysis to kind of see, if we spend this much, we think we can get this, we can get this.
Absolutely.
Try it. If we can roll back this way, if we spend this much, and it also has a social effect, we might be able to ratchet up the social force. That's very cool. So let me jump to another question. One of our attendees wanted to know, can you elaborate a bit on how you select the underlying time frame for the evaluation, particularly as you bring together the innovation and the customer management side? So many of these diffusion models go out 20 years. Or is there a rule of thumb? If I have an innovation and I want to kind of attempt to calculate its innovation equities, maybe I'm choosing between two different ways to invest. How long should that time frame be in a way that works for companies but also gets us a sense of what that curve might look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it hinges on maybe two ways to think about this. First of all, think about your category. So if your category is one where you're expecting sales to peak very early, that might affect the nature of how you think about what kind of parameters make sense for you to put in there, and then what makes sense for the time horizon to think about. So one rule of thumb is to say, think about when is it that you expect the peak to occur, peak of sales, because as we saw, there's the individual force. It stays relatively constant, and the social force, while the parameter itself may be constant, because there's more and more adopters, the effect itself starts growing, and it snowballs. And so at some point, you're going to get a peak set of sales. So one rule of thumb is to think about the horizon you want to look at is the time for the peak sales, because after the peak, it starts dwindling. So that's one rule of thumb, is to think about when you expect that peak to occur, and that be your time horizon. The other way to think about it is, if you know, for example, that you're going to be out there and you're going to plan a next version of the product, or you have upgrades that are going to come out at some point in time, then maybe a good horizon is, up until that point or shortly after, as a first cut, to create some kind of a forecast for yourself, as just in terms of what kind of point of time you want to look at to say, am I recouping any of the sales? Now, you could say that the early period is a loss leader. I'm going out there, I know I'm going to lose some money, but I'm going to get some feedback, going to improve the product, and let's see how it diffuses from there. But that's at least something you're conscious about, and you can say how much are you going to be willing to lose up until that point in time. So either look at when to expect peak sales as your time horizon, or look at sort of planned or anticipated events that you're going to be doing down the road, and put those as sort of milestones for your assessment. Oh,
that's great. And we've got another question, and I think it's because these folks know we have such an expert in innovation and diffusion on the line here. Have you seen, you talked about the bell curves and the saddle curves, and the question is, as you've studied this, have you seen those curves, the bell or saddle curves, change over the years, especially with respect to the social impact of social media. So are the turns in the curve more dramatic? Are we seeing changes in the slopes or the speed now that there's a greater opportunity for things to go viral?
That's quite interesting. I think there's two parts to this. One is the part on the diffusion itself, and the other part is what are the implications for customer lifetime value. So on the one hand, you would say, well, since what we're trying to capture with the social effect is the ability of people to communicate with one another, then we'd argue that the more able that people are to communicate with one another, the more that should facilitate a social force. And however, that cuts both ways, because you could also get negative or lukewarm communications about an innovation. So I would say this. Contingent on knowing that at the end of the day an innovation is going to succeed, I would say yes, you start seeing shortening of these effects. However, on the flip side of things, it could take longer for firms to get out of chasm-like situations if there is emerging or developing a negative spiral that they have to get out either by fixing the product or fixing their marketing. So I would say there is no one rule to what's happening, because I think the valence of what's being communicated is sort of going both ways, which is creating sometimes deeper dips in the saddle, or sometimes faster times to the takeoff. So by and large, I don't see any specific pattern, but we are seeing more heterogeneity, more variance than we did before in terms of how deep or how fast these things are happening.
Oh, that's great.
And then on the lifetime value part of this, it also has some effect because, for example, for Dropbox, people are joining, but it's not clear that their conversion rate to paying is going up either. So
right.
So you get that.
Yeah. So great questions, great answers. Elie, thank you so much. If we didn't get to your questions on the call, or if you want to reach out to Elie directly, you can reach him at eofek@hbs.edu. Our next webinar will be Applying Neuroscience to Market Research in Advertising and Branding, featuring Deepak Varma from Millward Brown on April 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Many thanks to all of you who joined us, and a special thanks to Elie for a great webinar.
Thank you so much.